This is a moment in Jewish history. Last week, I talked about the Cave of Machpela, also known as the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. Much can be said about this historic site, and so I would like to focus on one particular interesting aspect, the time a 12-year-old girl was sent inside the cave, the first person to enter in 700 years. This towering structure, built 2,000 years ago by King Herod the Great, covers the Cave of Machpela. Inside the building are 6 cenotaphs, or memorial markers, called in Hebrew tziyun. They are for Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. As I mentioned last week, Rachel is buried in the tomb of Rachel outside Bethlehem. If you have ever been to the Hall of Isaac and Rebekah, you probably have seen what they call the candle aperture, or also the entrance to the Garden of Eden. It looks kind of like a well, and if you hold your hand or face over the hole, you can feel the backdraft from the underground caves below. Or, as some describe, a whiff of the scent of the Garden of Eden. I have done this and felt the breeze, exactly as described in writings going back to the Middle Ages. But for 700 years, no one had actually been down there, and because the opening is so small, it would take a small person to fit through. In 1967, Israel returned to Hebron and the other historic cities in Judea and Samaria. The defense minister at the time was General Moshe Dayan. As an amateur archaeologist, he wanted the site explored, so he called upon his friend and colleague Michal Arbel. At the time, Michal Arbel headed the Israeli security agency Jerusalem district. He later became famous as a decorated pilot who served the Israeli Air Force for years, helping bring the legendary Dakota planes to Israel. He also led an Israeli rescue mission to help victims of an earthquake in Turkey. This was the year 1968, and he was called in for his amateur cave exploration, something he had done as a hobby with his daughter Michal. Thus, Michal Arbel, approximately 12 years old, became the first person in modern history to enter the Cave of Machpela. The following is an excerpt from the English edition of Living with the Bible by Moshe Dayan. He includes Michal's journal entry in which she describes her findings. For 700 years, from the 13th century until June 8, 1967, the structure above the traditional Cave of Machpela, and of course the cave itself, had been barred to Jews. The closest they were allowed to get to the cave area throughout those centuries was the steps on the outside of the eastern wall, and even then they were permitted to ascend only to the 7th step. From there they could insert a note of petition and supplication into a small hole in the wall, and it would flutter into the cave below. On the 4th day of the Six-Day War, when the Israeli army captured Hebron, the 700-year anti-Jewish ban was broken. Jews ascended beyond the 7th step and entered the building which marks the tombs of the patriarchs. The building had been erected as a Jewish shrine by King Herod toward the end of the 1st century. After the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, it was turned into a mosque. It was converted into a church by the Crusaders in the 12th century, and reconverted into a mosque after the Mamluk conquest a century and a half later. Its east wing served as a Muslim house of prayer. The west wing holds the tombs, which represent the sepulchres of the patriarchs. The cave lies somewhere beneath the floor of the structure. Jewish visitors came to Hebron in the tens of thousands after the Six-Day War to pay homage at the tombs of the patriarchs after being denied access for so long. Some brought Torah scrolls and a holy ark to house them and turned the west wing into a synagogue. This created the uneasy situation of a mosque and a synagogue housed cheek by jowl in one building, with Jews and Muslims under the same roof offering their different prayers within sound of one another. We had to devise an arrangement that would enable both communities to worship at the shrine without interference, disturbance, and clash. This would best be done by separating the two prayer halls even further and providing each with its own entrance. During our study of the problem, a proposal was put forth to erect a special synagogue hall just outside the building and link it to the underground story, namely the very underground chamber which, by tradition, holds the patriarchal tombs. The proposal was thought feasible because it was said that this chamber had once had an opening, now sealed, to the outside. If this proved true, it could now be reopened and the scaling bricks replaced by a door. This would make the synagogue a symbolic part of the building housing the shrine, and it would also serve as an entrance for Jewish visitors who could proceed to the tombs without having to go through the mosque. However, to discover whether there was indeed a sealed opening required a close inspection. This was not easy, for the chamber had no door, and in any case, entry was barred. It, or rather its darkness, could only be glimpsed through a grilled aperture in the floor of the mosque, which told us nothing. If entrance was to be effected at all, it could only be through the aperture. The first of such entries was undertaken by Michal, the daughter of one of our people. She was then a slender 12-year-old, able to wriggle through the 11-inch diameter aperture above the chamber. But more than that, she was a bright and courageous little girl who was unafraid not only of ghosts and spirits, their existence was not proven, she said, but also of snakes and scorpions, which were a very real danger. In the classic opening manner of suspense stories, on one dark and gloomy night, she was lowered by rope to the floor of the subterranean area, holding a flashlight in one hand and a camera in the other. She took several photographs and also made notes and sketches. It appeared that there were several later tombs, burial niches, and a flight of steps that did indeed lead to and end at a sealed opening, but it had given entry only to the upper story. There was no sign in the photographs of a scaled exit that had once led directly to the outside. I asked Michal for her photograph as a memento, together with a report of her survey adventure. This is what she wrote. Visit to the Cave of Machpela. On Wednesday, 9 October 1968, my mother asked me if I would agree to go through a small hole leading into a cave. After I agreed, she told me that it was to be the underground Cave of Machpela. A few hours later, my father woke me. I dressed and went into the car. In the car, I wrapped myself in a blanket. I must have looked like a bundle dumped on the back seat. We set off and reached Hebron. We stopped for a while at the police station, and then we went on to the building of the Cave of Machpela. I got out of the car, still covered in a blanket, and went into the mosque. I then saw the opening through which I was to enter. It measured and found to be exactly 11 inches in diameter. Ropes were tied round me, and I was given a torch and matches to test the air below, and I was lowered. I landed on a heap of papers and money bills. I found myself in a square room. Opposite me were 3 tombstones, the middle one higher and more decorated than the other 2. There was a small square opening in the wall opposite me. They released more rope, and I went through the opening. I found myself walking through a low, narrow corridor whose walls were cut out of the rock. The corridor had the shape of a box. Its corners were right-angled. At the end of the corridor was a stairwell, and the stairs ended in a built wall. I left, was drawn through the aperture, recounted all I had seen, and went down again. I measured the narrow corridor, and it was 34 paces long. When I counted the stairs, there were 15 when I went up, but 16 when I went down. I counted them again, going up and down 5 times, but the results were the same. The riser of each step was 10 inches. I went up the stairs the 6th time and knocked on the ceiling. I received answering knocks in return, and they pulled me back. They gave me a camera, and I went down again and photographed the square room, the tombstones, the corridor, and the staircase. I went up again, got a pencil and paper, returned below, and made sketches. I measured the room. It was 6 paces by 5. The width of each tombstone was 1 pace, and the space between the tombstones was also 1 pace. The width of the corridor was 1 pace, and its height was about a meter. I was pulled back up. On the way, I dropped the torch, and so I went down for it and was drawn back up again. Michal. Although we did not find the opening we were looking for, I am sure that the Chronicles of Israel will record with pride this visit of Michal, the first visit by a Jew to this site in 700 years. That was from Living with the Bible by Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan's idea of having Jewish prayer services in the underground cave below never worked out. Today, the site has separate sections with separate entrances for Muslims and Jews, and each religion gets 10 days a year corresponding to holidays and special days to reserve the site. Today, Michal Arbel is a respected professor at Tel Aviv University, where she lectures on literature and is an expert on the works of Nobel Prize laureate S.Y. Agnon. This has been a moment in Jewish history. For questions or comments or past shows, you can visit benbresky.substack.com. Thank you to all the listeners, and Shalom.